Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. My name is Kim, and tonight's case unfolds more like a horror story than true events. This happened in the middle of the 19th century in rural Ireland, and while this one incident has become more well-known, there are likely dozens, if not hundreds, of similar events that took place across the region for possibly centuries. This is the story of Bridget Cleary. But first, a Victorian Society tip. Since fairy lore figures heavily in tonight's story, I thought it would be a good idea to learn about how to protect yourself from fairies. In case you're not familiar, fairies, as they appear in Irish folklore, can be broadly defined as supernatural creatures with human appearance, magical powers, and trickster dispositions. They live in a world alongside ours that, by and large, humans cannot see. If humans impede on their world somehow, that bodes badly for the humans. But sometimes they can be helpful too. So it was important to remain in their good graces, which is harder to do than it sounds. And sometimes they didn't even care. Like humans, they have their own personalities, and sometimes they just felt like messing things up. So, seeing as one could find themselves as an unwilling participant in a fairy interaction, let's talk about how to defend yourself or at least try to coexist peacefully. First and foremost is, try to keep out of their way. There are some key places fairies are known to hang out and you want to avoid them. These include fairy hills or forts, fairy rings, fairy paths, and fairy trees. Fairy hills or forts are spots in nature with vague circular borders, and it's important to leave them undisturbed. Don't walk through them, build on them, cut back the brush, or let cattle graze on them. Those who do disturb fairy forts, either on purpose or accidentally, could find themselves maimed, killed, or the victim of financial ruin. They might also just disappear. Fairy rings are smaller than fairy forts, and you can recognize them by a ring of mushrooms or greener than usual grass. These are the result of the fairies dancing, usually under the moonlight, where they only become detectable by humans the next day. If a human steps inside, they will become invisible to others outside the ring. Once you're inside, you may be forced to dance to the point of exhaustion, death, or madness. While it is very hard to get back out, it's not impossible, but it does require intervention from someone on the outside, which may be hard to come by if they can't see you. But supposing someone knows you're in there, one thing they can do is throw wild marjoram and thyme into the circle to confuse the fairies. Also, the rescuer can touch the victim with iron. They can also reach into the fairy ring with the branch of a mountain ash tree and pull the person back out. It's commonly said, though, that it will take a year and a day at least before the person can be rescued. And if you do make it back out, you may not be quite the same. You may find that you have no memory of the incident, or what felt like a very short time in fairy world was actually months or even years in the human world. There also may be holdovers from the fairy world that can affect you as a human. In one story, a man could not retain his human form and turned to dust moments after being plucked out. In another, they were no longer able to eat human food and starved. And in another story, after being rescued, a woman touched a bit of iron and disappeared again. So it's best to avoid those altogether. Be careful, though, because fairies are very good at luring humans in. It's said wearing a hat or clothes backwards can confuse the fairies, then you're less likely to fall victim. Also keep an eye out for hawthorn trees, especially those standing alone, as those are usually guaranteed to be haunted by fairies. So not only must you be aware of fairy forts, fairy rings, and fairy trees, but also the fairy paths that connect these places. Where humans build our roads using natural borders like valleys, mountains, rivers, or lakes, those rules don't apply to fairy paths. Fairy paths are straight lines connecting these magical places, and like all other things in the fairy world, humans can't see them, which leaves ample opportunity for us to get in their way. Builders would map out the floor plan of a new construction, then place a pile of stones at each corner and leave it overnight. If in the morning the stones were undisturbed, it was safe to build there. It was also not advised to use white quartz in construction, as it was said to be a fairy stone. If you did accidentally build your house on a fairy path, though, well, that's unfortunate. Homeowners have been known to knock down corners of their house they suspected intersected with a fairy path. They also might leave the doors and windows open all night so fairies could pass through easily. If fairies did knock down a building in their way, though, it usually only happened twice. Upon being rebuilt a third time, the house would remain standing. Fairies could honestly be anywhere, though. Caves, barrows, hollow trees, gnarled roots were all places fairies could hang out. So, seeing as overlap between fairies and humans was bound to happen, let's move on to discussing some tactics to keep yourself safe. First, how to protect your home. Various plants and herbs were said to be effective in deterring fairies, including garlands of marsh marigold or primrose above your door. It was common to protect stables with these as well, otherwise fairies might borrow your horses in the night, leaving them exhausted by morning. St. John's wort was also effective, as well as berries, leaves, or wood from rowan, mountain ash, or holly trees. Iron is also said to deter fairies. It's common to still see an iron horseshoe over a door for good luck. Fairies also had an aversion to bread. It's a product of the home and the hearth and taming of nature, so they didn't like it. Another tactic, since fairies were notoriously hard to keep away, was to instead appease them. Many homes left offerings of milk or butter on their porch for fairies. But you can't be in your home all the time. So next, let's talk about some ways to protect yourself when you're out and about. First, charms or walking sticks made from the wood of rowan or ash trees could be worn or carried. It's also said that possessing a four-leaf clover would allow you a one-time chance of seeing fairies or through their glamour or magical disguises. It was a tradition to sew several clovers into a tiny bag to be worn around the neck. Also, keeping an iron nail in your pocket at all times was a good habit, and if you thought you might be approaching somewhere fairies might be, you could wear your coat inside out to try and confuse them. Again, bread worked just as well on the road as it did in the home. If it didn't repel them, you could always offer some as a peace offering and hopefully go on your way. A handful of oatmeal in your pocket could have a similar effect. Another common problem was fairies stealing or extracting nourishment from food brought to those working in the fields. In this case, sprinkling the food with salt would keep it safe. Children were especially susceptible to fairy pranks or even kidnapping. So here's some tips on how to keep your little safe. Hang a pair of iron shears on the wall near a baby's bed. Create daisy chains to be worn around their neck or head. Tuck a piece of bread inside the child's clothes, especially if they have to be taken outside at night. Or sew iron nails or amber beads into the hems of their clothing. If you did run afoul of the fairies, it was common to consult a wise woman. These were professional or semi-professional practitioners of magic from the medieval period to the early 20th century who primarily worked with spells and charms. So that's it. Pretty simple, right? Peacefully coexist, don't go looking for them, and that last bit of advice that I convey is don't talk about them too much. Which makes me think this is probably the perfect place to end this tip for tonight. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. Please take care while listening. So I think the best way to go about this case is to first just relate the events that happened. Then we'll go back and try to understand the reasoning and motives that created it. Bridget Boland was born in 1869 in Tipperary County, Ireland. At the age of 18, she met Michael Cleary in the town of Clonmel, where they both worked. Michael was a cooper, meaning he made barrels and kegs and that sort of thing. Bridget was working as an apprentice dressmaker. The pair met in the month of July in 1887, and by August, they were married. After they were married, instead of moving in together, Bridget continued living with her parents while Michael stayed in Clonmel to work. Bridget purchased a Singer sewing machine for her dressmaking, and she also looked after her own flock of chickens and sold eggs to her neighbors. And this was kind of a big deal for women at the time. Bridget was really kind of a boss babe, which was not always well received within the community. Some viewed the arrangement as rather unusual, though conceded so long as they were happy. But for others, Bridget was far too independent for how folks did things around there. Things changed, though, in February of 1894 when Bridget's mother died and she and Michael became responsible for the care of her elderly father, Patrick. Because Patrick could no longer work, he qualified for what was essentially low-income affordable housing. The Cashel Poor Law Guardians had recently constructed a number of cottages in the area, each including 2 bedrooms, a loft, kitchen, and outhouse. Bridget and Michael were able to move into one of these with her father. Their cottage specifically was south-facing and set before Slievenamon Mountain, commanding a sweeping view of the entire valley. It was arguably the nicest house in the whole village. However, despite being so desirable, it had been passed over several times before. The reason being, it was rumored to have been built on the site of a fairy ring fort. The role of fairies in Ireland is vast and could take up an entire podcast in itself to explore. But for our purposes tonight, we can broadly define fairies as creatures with human appearance, magical powers, and a penchant for trickery. And fairy ring forts were where they lived. Tales associated with fairy forts typically relate a curse or retribution enacted upon those who would disturb or destroy the structures, including the stealing of farm animals or people, typically women or children, never to be seen again. I feel like here in 2026, if you asked people if they believe in fairies, the majority would answer no, they are fiction. But in 1894 Ireland, the majority would very well have answered yes. So you understand why it was really quite bold of the Clearys to move into this cottage. On March 4th of 1895, Bridget got sick with a nasty lung infection. Over the next few days, Bridget's family walked to the local doctor 3 times to ask him to call on Bridget. When he finally came over a week later on March 13th, the doctor said her outlook was pretty grim and suggested a priest be called to administer last rites. Over the approximately week and a half since Bridget had fallen ill, she'd shown no improvement. She'd only got sicker and sicker, and now a priest was to be called? Bridget's family did not understand how this otherwise healthy, vivacious young woman, well and walking around one day, was laid so low the next that now she was at death's door. And this is when whispers of fairies started. Over the next 2 days, several of Bridget's friends and family members attended to her. On the 15th, Michael summoned the priest, Father Ryan, back to the Cleary household for spiritual support and advice. When Father Ryan arrived, he found Bridget alive but agitated. Michael said he had not been giving her the medicine the doctor prescribed, as he didn't think it would be effective in what was actually wrong with Bridget. When Father Ryan asked him what he meant, Michael somewhat cryptically replied to the effect that people may have some remedy of their own that might do more good than a doctor's medicine. Father Ryan gave Bridget communion, then departed. That night is when everything really came off the rails. Neighbors and relatives gathered at the Cleary house that night, where some of them agreed that the only explanation for Bridget not getting better was because she was not, in fact, Bridget anymore, but a changeling. They suspected that the real human Bridget had been kidnapped by the fairies, and what they had in the house now was actually a fairy disguised to look like Bridget, and that's why she was so sick. Bridget's husband, Michael, decided tonight was the night. He was getting his wife back. So he attempted to force-feed Bridget some sort of remedy, which she refused. At this, Michael became enraged and threw her down on the hearth, threatening her with a burning piece of wood, as fairies are known to be fearful of fire. And Bridget certainly was afraid at this point, which only incited Michael more. He threw an oil lamp down on the hearth, which splattered all over Bridget, causing her clothes to catch fire. Now remember, this is happening in a house full of people. When others tried to intervene, Michael prevented them, reminding them this was not Bridget and had not been for over a week. And they were all forced to stand there and watch Bridget burn to death on the hearth. By the next day, rumors had begun to circulate that Bridget was missing. Local police began inquiring about Bridget's whereabouts, and the priest, Father Ryan, noticed Michael fervently praying, apparently standing vigil in the home. When questioned, Michael stated that his wife had been taken by the fairies and he was now waiting for her to come back. Over the course of the next couple days, statements were gathered about the others that had been in the house and what had transpired. On March 22nd, the burned body of Bridget Cleary was found in a shallow grave. A coroner's inquest returned the verdict of death by burning. Charges of murder were brought against Michael Cleary, Bridget's father, Patrick Boland, and 3 other present, Mary Kennedy, James Kennedy, and Patrick Kennedy. 4 more who were present that night were also charged with wounding. The trial began on July 3rd, where the jury was led out to a storage building where Bridget's body was being kept to view the charred remains. This convinced jurors of the horrible suffering Bridget had endured, and ultimately, 7 of the 9 defendants were handed down sentences. The sentences were 5 years of penal servitude for Patrick Kennedy, 6 months of hard labor for Michael Kennedy, 18 months hard labor for William Kennedy, 6 months hard labor for Bridget's elderly father, Patrick Boland, 3 years of penal servitude for John Doon, and 20 years of penal servitude for Michael Cleary, who was convicted of manslaughter. The manslaughter verdict was handed down on the grounds that Michael had not intended to kill his wife, but cure her. He would serve 15 years before he was released in April of 1910, after which he moved to Liverpool, immigrated to Montreal, Canada, and remarried all in the same year. The case made waves because at the time, Irish Home Rule was an active political issue in England. The English used the Cleary case as evidence that the Irish were an uneducated and brutal people who were unable to govern themselves. So we've made it through the events as they transpired. But now let's take some time to unpack the lore and superstition, as well as the motive behind this unfortunate case. Bridget's downfall came from Michael's belief that Bridget had become a changeling. Fairy belief in general was pervasive in rural Irish communities at the time and had long coexisted beside Christian doctrine. We briefly stated before that fairies are creatures with human appearance, magical powers, and are tricksters. They exist in kind of a hidden world alongside humans where they can bestow favor upon those who treat them with respect or pretty much mess stuff up. Anything from spoiled milk to damaged crops to injury and death could be attributed to fairies. Changelings specifically were fairies who were sent to live in the human world for whatever reason. Beautiful women and children were especially susceptible to being snatched by fairies and replaced by a changeling. It was said the fairies wanted these women and children to sometimes embolden their own lineage to keep as servants or sometimes punish those they felt had wronged them. They were even more susceptible if they ventured near a fairy fort. And remember, the Cleary's cottage was said to have been built right on top of one. You would know someone was a changeling usually by a sudden decrease in health and vivacity. If someone suddenly became sick and the doctor couldn't find a reason, or if a child started to regress or was seemingly born healthy and then failed to thrive, sometimes even if a child was just fussy or particularly gifted in intelligence. Those were all indicators that your real friend or family member had been swapped with a fairy, trying its best to masquerade as human. So, here and now in the 21st century, scientists and scholars have arrived at generally accepted explanations for much of this. What people living during the 19th century thought were fairy ring forts, we've been able to discover were early prehistoric dwellings dating back to the late Iron Age and early Christian times. These early civilizations built circular structures marked by earth banks, ditches, or primitive stone walls. Over time, the structures obviously decayed until all that remained are vague circular perimeters that no longer resemble anything man-made. It's also reason that babies or children labeled as changelings could actually have been developmentally disabled or experiencing regressive autism. Often these conditions are not apparent at birth, but over time, the child will start to miss developmental milestones, and it becomes evident that something about the child is different. We know these are almost always conditions that are present since birth, but those living in 19th century Ireland would just see a normal, healthy baby until a certain point where the child inexplicably declines. They were obviously not aware of genetics or chromosomal abnormalities. They thought some sort of outside force was at work and blamed it on fairies and changelings. Now that we understand a bit more about fairies and changelings, we can go inside the Cleary household a bit more. On the day Bridget became ill, she had been out making her usual egg deliveries. It was noted that she had a habit of lingering near somewhere called Kilmanana Hill that was also rumored to be the site of a fairy fort. When she got home, she reported having a raging headache when she went to bed, which quickly turned into a fever and lung infection. Bridget was very sick. She probably contracted some virus that went into her chest and became a bacterial infection. She needed antibiotics, but they didn't have those back then. No one could understand why Bridget wasn't getting any better. She was otherwise a young, healthy, vibrant woman, and her quick decline terrified her neighbors and family. To them, this wasn't a normal illness. Something else was going on. Now, as we discussed, fairy lore ran deep in 19th century Ireland, and a local traditional storyteller, John Donne, was the first to suggest to Michael that maybe the woman in Bridget's bed was not Bridget. This seed grew in Michael's brain, and he eventually came to the realization that Bridget actually seemed more beautiful than her usual self, and she was also 2 inches taller. Others likely argued this point with Michael, but he was her husband and he knew her better than anyone, so he would not be convinced. By the time the doctor and priest had been, Michael had already decided that their help was of no use in their house, and he visited a man named Dennis Gainey, who is described as a fairy doctor. Dennis Gainey was well versed in remedies and charms for undoing fairy magic. He prescribed a tincture of herbs and the first milk produced from a cow after calving, which Michael made. But when he tried to get Bridget to drink it, it was so bitter that she gagged. Michael took this as further evidence that she was indeed a fairy and they needed to escalate their plan. Michael, her father, John Donne, and Dennis Gainey pinned Bridget down and forced her to drink the mixture. They threw urine on her and threatened her with a hot poker. At first, it was reported that she fought them, wild and deranged, and then she seemed to calm. The men took this to mean that the remedies were having an effect, but in all likelihood, Bridget was probably terrified and exhausted and hoped compliance might stave them off. After this, Michael began aggressively interrogating Bridget to prove she was her human self. The number 3 holds significance in fairy lore, so everything Michael asked of her, he asked 3 times. Still suffering from a fever and infection, Bridget was pushed to the point of delirium and struggled to answer him consistently. Each time she failed, they would haul her out of bed and repeat threatening her with the hot poker. Bridget likely knew that if she couldn't manage to convince them she wasn't a changeling, they were going to kill her. So at some point, she rallied herself, got up, got dressed, and asked for breakfast. Those in the house watched her carefully. Then Bridget asked if they had any milk for breakfast. It was said the fairies always craved fresh milk, and at this, Michael flew into a rage and again accused her of being a changeling. Bridget was at the end of her rope herself and clapped back that Michael's mother had been one to fraternize with the fairies, and that's why he thought she was too. Michael's sanity was hanging by a thread as it was, but then it snapped. He demanded she eat 3 pieces of bread to prove that she was not a fairy. She ate 2, but paused a moment too long before bringing the 3rd piece to her lips. Upon seeing this, Michael grabbed her by the throat and threw her down before the fire. She asked for tea or water to eat the bread with, but Michael refused and forced 2 more pieces of bread into her mouth. When she could not manage the 3rd, he was convinced this was not his wife. He stripped her down to her chemise and threw her on the hearth before a room full of people. At this point, all present said they tried to intervene, but Michael threw the kerosene lamp down, which caused Bridget to catch fire. Then he held back the onlookers as Bridget burned. All the while, he insisted it was not his wife he was burning, and they'd soon seen her go up the chimney. Once it was clear that Bridget was gone, he locked everyone in the house and left to go bury the charred remains of her body. The next morning, John Donne brought an agitated and bereft Michael to church to receive a blessing. But the priest didn't think Michael was in a state to receive the sacrament. When he tried to ask John Donne what happened, his answer was so bizarre, the priest went straight to the police, who, as we discussed earlier, opened an investigation and eventually discovered Bridget's body. While they carried out their investigation, it was said that Michael sat and waited at the nearby fairy fort for 3 days and nights, waiting for Bridget to return on a white horse. This certainly sounds fantastical to us, and despite a general widespread belief in fairy lore, it did indeed sound fantastical to a lot of people at that time as well. They wondered if Michael just used the Changeling story as an excuse for murder and looked for other motives. One being the ever-present motive of misogyny and jealousy. Bridget led a very independent and modern lifestyle for the time and place. She had her own seamstress business where she made enough money to purchase an expensive sewing machine. She had her side hustle of selling eggs. She was married but continued to work and live separately from her husband, and the couple did not have any children. Plus, she was said to be quite outgoing and beautiful. A lot of the local wives didn't like this. Neither did a lot of the local men. And Michael certainly would have felt pressure for being responsible for bringing his wife to heel. This stemmed rumors that Bridget was having an affair with a man who lived near Kilnamana Hill, and that is why she lingered there that day. Some suggest that was the real reason for Michael's rage and eventual murder of his wife, Bridget. However, most scholars agree with the courts of the time that Michael did genuinely think his wife was a changeling, and his intention was not to kill her, but to get her back. Today, we have a name for this too. It's called Capgras delusion, or folie à plusieurs, which means the madness of several. Capgras delusion is a psychiatric disorder in which a person holds a delusion that a friend, spouse, parent, or other close family member or pet has been replaced by an identical imposter. It's a syndrome named after Joseph Capgras, who was a French psychiatrist that first described the disorder in 1923. Folie à plusieurs, or madness of several, is best understood as shared psychosis. This syndrome is most commonly diagnosed when two or more individuals live in proximity, may be socially or physically isolated, and have little interaction with other people, of which rural Irish communities could qualify. A subclassification is folie impulsée, in which one dominant person forms a delusional belief during a psychotic episode and imposes it on another person or persons. Which, I'm not a psychiatrist, but this sounds close to what happened inside the Cleary house. Another possibility is that it was a case of mass hysteria that started with Michael. Like folie à plusieurs, mass hysteria tends to show up among people who belong to the same close, often isolated group or community. It arises during sudden tension and anxiety, which spreads amongst the group. I personally think the latter explanation is the most reasonable. I believe Michael did develop some sort of Capgras delusion that spread in varying degrees to her father and neighbors. I am curious to know what you think about this case, though. Do you think Michael truly thought Bridget was a changeling? Do you think his sentence was just? And what about the others who stood by and just let it happen? And also, do you believe in fairies? If you're listening on Spotify, you can comment on the episode right there. Or if you head over to Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder, you can let me know there too. I've also posted some photos of the Clearys, their home, and a fairy ring fort, in case you need to know how to recognize them. You can also see the photos and source links for this episode on the episode blog on my website at A Good Night for a Murder. The bonus content for Patreon members for this episode is 3 more unfortunate historic murder cases where Capgras syndrome and folie à deux played a role. Listen through the outro music to hear a short preview of this Patreon bonus content. To subscribe to Patreon and learn more about the podcast, you can visit agoodnightforamurder.com. Also, follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder. Please rate and review and share with friends. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon. And this is to accompany episode 53 about Bridget Cleary. I'm going to tell you about 3 more cases where Capgras syndrome and folie à deux played a role. In the regular episode this month, I covered Bridget Cleary, whose husband received a verdict of manslaughter for believing she was a changeling and administering a cure, which actually killed her. As a refresher, a changeling was a fairy who had been swapped with a human. You would usually know someone was a changeling by a sudden decrease in health and vivacity. For example, if someone suddenly became sick and the doctor couldn't find any reason, as in Bridget's case, or in the case of a child, if the child was seemingly born healthy, then started to regress, or suddenly failed to thrive. Today, it's reasonable to think that babies or children labeled as changelings could actually have been developmentally disabled or experiencing regressive autism. But those living in 19th century Ireland were not aware of those things. They thought some sort of outside force must be at work and blamed it on the fairies and changelings. Bridget's case made waves as it was used as an example by the English that the Irish were not capable of governing themselves. But in truth, similar tragic cases had taken place all over Ireland, Scotland, England, and more. One documented case is that of 4-year-old Michael Leahy. Now, young Michael could neither speak nor stand, so his family sought the help of an elderly woman named Anne Roach. Newspapers at the time described Anne as claiming to have supernatural abilities and healing skills. I think it's reasonable to say that Anne was what they also called a wise woman, or in Bridget's story, a fairy doctor. These were professional or semi-professional practitioners of magic who primarily worked with spells and charms to resolve issues with fairies. Details in the case are sparse, but ultimately, in 1826, in County Kerry, Ireland, it was reported that Anne had directed 2 people, I'm assuming Michael's parents or other family, to bathe the boy in the River Flesk each morning. On the 3rd morning, little Michael was held under too long and drowned. The court charged not the 2 bathing him, but Anne Roach. Court testimony stated the intent was not to kill the child, but to cure him by putting the fairy out. At the direction of the judge, the court found Anne not guilty of murder, stating that it would, quote, not be safe in convicting the prisoner of murder, however strong the suspicion might be. This verdict goes to show just how deeply belief in fairies and changelings ran in rural 19th century Ireland. In the regular episode, we talked about how we now have a name for the belief that someone had been replaced by an identical imposter, and that is Capgras syndrome. Another case involving Capgras syndrome was that of artist Richard Dadd in 1843. Originally from Chatham in Kent, England, Dadd was mostly raised in London by his father and stepmother, having lost his own mother at a young age. By the age of 25, Dadd had become an accomplished painter. Somewhat ironically, given the theme of our episodes this month, his subject matter often featured fairies and other supernatural subjects, Orientalist scenes, and enigmatic genre scenes. If you take a look at some of his art, it'll help understand what that means. In 1842, Sir Thomas Phillips asked Dadd to accompany him on a grand tour of Europe, Greece, Turkey, southern Syria, and finally Egypt to document the journey with drawings and later paintings. In November of that year, they spent a grueling 2 weeks in southern Syria, passing from Jerusalem to Jordan and returning across the Engadi wilderness. Toward the end of December, while traveling up the Nile by boat, Dadd underwent a dramatic personality change. He became delusional, increasingly violent, and believed himself to be under the influence of the Egyptian god Osiris. It was suspected this was all caused by sunstroke, and Dadd returned home to England early. When he arrived in May of 1843, he was taken by his family to recuperate in the rural village of Cobham, Kent. Unfortunately, Dadd's delusion only grew to the point that he believed the Egyptian god Osiris was his father.